Dawn broke reluctantly over the Palawan Passage on that October morning in 1944, the sky still clinging to the grey uncertainty between night and day. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of his heavy cruiser Otago, his binoculars trained on the horizon as he had been for much of the pre-dawn watch. The time was precisely 5:34 in the morning, and irritation had begun to creep into the Admiral's demeanour. For the third time since first light, his lookouts had reported another periscope sighting, and Kurita's patience with what he considered phantom threats had worn dangerously thin. Turning to his chief of staff with barely concealed frustration, Kurita spoke words that would later be preserved in the testimony of Lieutenant Commander Ishiguro Nobuo, one of the few bridge officers who would survive what came next. The Admiral's dismissal was absolute and damning. These lookouts, he complained, were seeing periscopes in every wave that rolled past their position. They were spreading panic throughout the fleet over absolutely nothing, jumping at shadows and imagining threats where none existed. 23 minutes later, the world exploded around Takeo Kurita. 4 torpedoes launched from the American submarine USS Dace ripped through Otago's hull with devastating precision. The flagship, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and nerve center of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since the disaster at Midway, began her death throes. Within 18 minutes, she would disappear beneath the waves. Kurita himself found himself struggling in oil-slicked water that burned his eyes and throat, watching his command sink beneath him, experiencing something that Japanese naval officers had insisted was impossible for 3 full years of war. What Kurita witnessed in those desperate minutes in the water was the materialization of a threat his service had categorically refused to acknowledge. American submarines had just initiated what would become the systematic destruction of Japanese naval power. By the time the sun set that evening, 3 heavy cruisers would rest on the ocean floor, all victims of just 2 American submarines operating in coordination. The mathematical equation of Japan's maritime destruction was being written across the Pacific in torpedo wakes, yet even as their empire slowly strangled from the strangulation of shipping losses, Japanese leaders maintained their absolute refusal to believe the truth. American submarines were systematically destroying over 5 million tons of their merchant vessels and warships. Understanding how this denial persisted against overwhelming evidence until the final moments of the war requires examining how institutional arrogance and fundamentally flawed naval doctrine can blind military leadership to existential threats. More remarkably, this blindness continued even as those threats methodically destroyed their nation's capacity to wage war itself. The genesis of Japan's inability to see submarines as a serious threat traced back decades, to the 1920s, when the Imperial Japanese Navy crystallized its doctrine for the anticipated war with the United States. This strategy, refined through countless iterations of war games conducted at the Naval War College in Tokyo, envisioned a climactic surface engagement somewhere in the vast reaches of the Western Pacific. This battle would be a 20th-century version of Tsushima, that legendary engagement where Japanese naval power had crushed the Russian fleet. In this carefully planned future battle, Japanese superiority in night-fighting techniques and torpedo warfare would annihilate the American fleet in a decisive engagement. Within this grand vision, submarines occupied a specific and decidedly limited role. Japanese submarines would function as scouts for the main battle fleet, operating ahead of the decisive engagement to whittle down American forces as they crossed the Pacific toward the inevitable confrontation. These submarines would target exclusively military vessels, warships worthy of precious torpedoes. Merchant vessels were beneath consideration, unworthy targets that didn't merit the attention of a proper naval force. This doctrine became formally codified during the 1930s as the strategy of attrition followed by decisive battle, and it shaped absolutely every aspect of Japanese submarine development, training, and operational thinking. Captain Taketani Toshikazu, who commanded the submarine I-8 throughout the war, later explained in his memoir, published in 1962, how deeply this thinking penetrated the service. His training had emphasized repeatedly that attacking merchant ships was fundamentally dishonorable, nothing more than a waste of torpedoes that should be carefully preserved for use against warships. The American focus on commerce raiding, he noted, seemed to confirm in Japanese eyes that the Americans possessed an inferior understanding of proper naval warfare. Japan's own operational experience in the war's opening months served only to reinforce this doctrinal blindness. During the first half of 1942, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific in an apparently unstoppable wave of conquest, their submarines achieved remarkably minimal success against Allied merchant shipping. Japanese I-boats prowled Australian waters and ranged across the Indian Ocean, yet they sank only handfuls of merchants while searching constantly for the warship targets that rarely materialized in positions where they could be attacked. Japanese naval leadership drew what seemed to them an obvious conclusion from this experience. If their own submarines, which they considered superior in design and capability, couldn't significantly impact merchant shipping operations, then the inferior American boats certainly posed no serious threat. The statistics compiled by the Japanese Navy seemed to validate this assumption completely. By June of 1942, Japanese submarines had managed to sink only 98 merchant vessels in 6 full months of warfare, totaling approximately 420,000 tons. This averaged out to merely 70,000 tons destroyed per month by a force of 64 submarines. If Japan's supposedly superior submarine force achieved such modest results against Allied shipping, Japanese planners reasoned, how could American submarines, which their intelligence services rated as technically inferior, possibly pose any serious threat to Japanese maritime commerce? American submarine successes against Japanese shipping actually began almost immediately following the Pearl Harbor attack, but Japanese naval intelligence developed systematic methods for underestimating or outright dismissing these losses. When USS Gudgeon managed to sink the 5,400-ton freighter I-73 on January 27, 1942, marking the first confirmed American submarine kill of a Japanese merchant vessel, the loss was officially attributed to a mine strike. This pattern of deliberate misattribution would continue unbroken throughout the entire war, becoming standard practice in Japanese loss analysis. Commander Fujimori Yasuo, who served within the Naval General Staff's intelligence section, revealed during post-war interrogations the systematic nature of this misattribution. The Japanese had developed rigid formulas for analyzing ship losses, formulas that essentially guaranteed undercounting submarine effectiveness. If a ship disappeared without any witnesses to its fate, the loss was automatically assumed to be a marine casualty, perhaps weather-related or due to mechanical failure. If survivors managed to report an explosion, the official records would note probable mine damage. Only when survivors could specifically report actually seeing a submarine or observing torpedo tracks would Japanese intelligence attribute the loss to submarine attack. Even then, reports might be questioned or discounted. This systematic undercounting was further compounded by the intense rivalry between the Japanese Army and Navy, institutions that often seemed more interested in competing with each other than cooperating against their common enemies. The Japanese Army operated its own extensive shipping fleet to support its operations and rarely shared loss reports with the Navy. When Army transports disappeared, they frequently weren't included in Navy shipping statistics at all. The Tsurugamaru, a 6,783-ton Army transport sunk by USS Pickerel on April 7, 1943, wasn't recorded in Navy loss statistics until after the war had ended and comprehensive records could be compiled. By December 1942, American submarines had actually destroyed 139 Japanese vessels totaling 580,000 tons. Japanese naval intelligence, however, acknowledged only 67 ships totaling 230,000 tons lost to submarine action. This massive gap between reality and official recognition became tragically apparent in the conduct of convoy operations. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka Taizuke, who served as a convoy escort commander, maintained a detailed personal diary throughout the war that survived to provide devastating testimony. His March 15, 1943 entry recorded departing Palau with a convoy of 8 vessels and arriving at Rabaul with only 3. Headquarters, he noted bitterly, recorded this convoy as successful with minimal losses to unknown causes. His May 2 entry documented 7 ships departing Surabaya, with only 2 reaching Manila. Official reports attributed the losses to marine casualties during severe weather, but Tanaka noted there had been no severe weather. His August 20th entry recorded the most devastating example. A convoy of 12 ships departed Singapore. 4 reached their destination. The official summary characterized these losses as sporadic casualties due to various causes, concluding that convoy operations were proceeding satisfactorily. The Japanese Navy's monthly secret intelligence summary for September 1943, which was declassified after the war, acknowledged total merchant shipping losses of 172,000 tons for that month. Post-war analysis confirmed actual losses were 263,000 tons, with over 200,000 tons of that total attributable to submarine attacks. The systematic underestimation wasn't just significant, it was catastrophic in its implications for strategic planning. By early 1944, Japan confronted a shipping crisis that threatened the empire's very survival. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and mathematically simple, yet Japanese leadership performed remarkable feats of statistical gymnastics to avoid confronting the reality staring them in the face. Japan had entered the war possessing approximately 6.3 million tons of merchant shipping. By January 1944, despite adding 3.2 million tons through new construction and captured vessels, the merchant fleet had actually shrunk to 4.8 million tons. The mathematics were devastatingly simple, even a schoolchild could perform the calculation. Japan had lost 4.7 million tons of shipping in just 2 years of war, yet the Imperial Navy's official assessment attributed only 1.2 million tons of these losses to enemy submarine action. Captain Atsushi Oe, who worked in the Naval General Staff's logistics section, provided testimony after the war that exposed the depth of institutional denial. They knew ships were disappearing at an alarming rate, he explained. They simply refused to acknowledge submarines as the primary cause. It had become institutionally impossible to admit that the enemy was succeeding brilliantly with a strategy the Japanese Navy had dismissed as worthless and dishonorable. The Navy's doctrine had created what amounted to a cognitive prison, trapping them in their own assumptions. Having declared commerce warfare ineffective and beneath the dignity of a proper naval force, they couldn't acknowledge its devastating success without simultaneously admitting fundamental errors in judgment that went to the core of their institutional identity. Instead, losses were attributed to an ever-expanding catalogue of alternative causes. Marine accidents, mines, aircraft attacks, surface raiders, severe weather, anything and everything except submarines. The list of excuses grew as the losses mounted, but submarines remained conveniently absent from official analysis. June 1944 brought a new and even more terrifying evolution to Japanese shipping lanes. American submarines began implementing wolfpack tactics, with coordinated groups of 3 or 4 submarines operating together to concentrate overwhelming force against convoys. The Japanese, who had never developed effective pack tactics for their own submarines, found themselves completely unprepared for this tactical evolution. Their convoy doctrine, such as it existed, assumed single submarine attacks that escorts could drive off through aggressive counterattack. Convoy High 71 departed Singapore on August 10, 1944, bound for Japan with critical supplies of oil, rubber and tin that the home islands desperately needed. The convoy consisted of 12 merchant vessels protected by 6 destroyers, which represented a powerful escort force by Japanese standards at that point in the war. What followed would be recorded as one of the war's most devastating convoy battles, a slaughter that demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of coordinated submarine operations. Between August 17th and 19th, American submarines struck repeatedly in carefully coordinated attacks. USS Rasher, Spadefish, Redfish, and Bluefish worked together to systematically dismantle the convoy. The slaughter that ensued was unprecedented in its scale and brutality. Over 8,500 Japanese personnel died in less than 24 hours of sustained attacks. The 8,500-ton transport Tomatsu Maru went down with 4,755 troops trapped aboard. The 11,600-ton Maru sank with 2,665 soldiers. In total, 7 ships totaling over 40,000 tons were destroyed in this single coordinated operation. The Japanese Navy's official report on Convoy High 71 minimized the disaster almost to the point of absurdity. The report acknowledged that the convoy had encountered enemy submarine activity and that several vessels had been lost, but characterized escort operations as partially successful in delivering the remaining ships to their destination. Commander Hara Tamichi, one of Japan's most skilled and experienced destroyer captains who participated in numerous convoy battles throughout the war, later wrote with obvious bitterness about the systematic editing of his reports. He had reported the true scale and intensity of submarine attacks repeatedly and in detail, yet his reports were consistently edited by headquarters before being incorporated into official assessments. They could not accept, he wrote, that American submarines had become this effective, this dangerous, and this dominant in Japanese waters. Japan's most critical vulnerability, the one that would ultimately prove fatal, was oil. The conquered Netherlands East Indies produced abundant petroleum in quantities that could theoretically fuel the empire's war machine, but that petroleum was worthless without tankers to transport it to Japanese refineries and from there to the fleet and industry. American submarines made tankers their absolute priority targets, hunting them with single-minded determination, and the results proved catastrophic for Japan's ability to wage war. Japan started the war possessing 578,000 tons of tanker capacity. Through desperate and sustained construction efforts that diverted resources from other critical needs, this capacity peaked at 873,000 tons in 1943. But by early 1945, tanker tonnage had collapsed to just 266,948 tons, less than half the capacity Japan possessed at the war's beginning. The mathematics of fuel starvation were working themselves out with inexorable logic, yet Japanese planning continued to assume that tanker losses would somehow remain manageable and that adequate fuel supplies would be available for planned operations. Captain Shiraishi Kazutaka, who commanded the tanker Nippon Maru, described the reality of tanker operations in his personal diary with brutal honesty. Every voyage had become Russian roulette, he wrote. They sailed independently because headquarters continued to insist that tankers were too fast for submarines to catch. This was pure fantasy, divorced from operational reality. He himself had been attacked 4 separate times and survived only through luck, not through any advantage in speed or maneuverability. Shiraishi's luck finally ran out on January 14, 1944. USS Nautilus put 3 torpedoes into Nippon Maru off Saipan. The 9,975-ton tanker sank rapidly, taking with her 2,000 tons of desperately needed aviation gasoline that would never reach Japanese airfields. Japanese records listed the cause of loss as probable mine damage, maintaining the fiction that submarines weren't the primary threat. The attrition of tankers accelerated dramatically through 1944. In October alone, American submarines destroyed 23 tankers totaling 178,000 tons. The Japanese Navy's war diary acknowledged increased tanker losses to various causes, carefully avoiding specificity, but continued planning major operations on the assumption that normal fuel availability would somehow be maintained. The cognitive dissonance between planning assumptions and operational reality had become complete. By late 1944, Japan finally attempted to implement a proper convoy system based on lessons that should have been learned years earlier, but the effort proved too little and far too late to matter. The Grand Escort Command, established in November 1943, had been given inadequate resources and insufficient authority to coordinate effective convoy protection. Even worse, Japanese anti-submarine warfare capabilities remained primitive compared to Allied standards, lacking the technological and tactical sophistication necessary to counter modern submarine operations. Captain Matsuyama Mitsuharu, who commanded escort vessels throughout this period, described the hopeless situation his forces confronted with each convoy operation. They possessed no radar, inadequate sonar equipment, and insufficient depth charges even when they could locate a submarine. They couldn't communicate effectively between escort vessels to coordinate responses. American submarines attacked at night on the surface, using radar to maintain contact with their targets while remaining invisible to escorts who couldn't see them and lacked the technology to detect them electronically. Japanese escorts were blind men attempting to fight opponents who could see in the dark. The statistics compiled after the war told the story of systematic failure with mathematical precision. In 1944 alone, American submarines sank 603 Japanese vessels, totaling 2.7 million tons. Japanese anti-submarine forces claimed 18 American submarines destroyed during the same period. Actual American submarine losses were 19 boats, remarkably close to Japanese claims, and suggesting their loss estimates were reasonably accurate when they bothered to make them. The exchange ratio, however, was devastating beyond comprehension. Japan lost 141 tons of shipping for every ton of American submarine destroyed. No nation could sustain such losses and survive as a functioning maritime power. Even as Japan's maritime lifeline systematically collapsed ship by ship and ton by ton, senior leadership maintained their denial through increasingly absurd reasoning. At a liaison conference in February 1945, when confronted with shipping statistics that showed catastrophic losses threatening the home islands with starvation, Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Oikawa Koshiro characterized the crisis as temporary disruptions in shipping schedules due to various factors, including weather, port congestion, and sporadic enemy action. The situation would stabilize, he assured the conference, with improved coordination between services. At that precise moment, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships at a sustained rate exceeding 300,000 tons per month. The sporadic enemy action Oikawa dismissed so casually had become the leading cause of death for Japanese merchant mariners, who faced mortality rates exceeding those of many combat infantry units. While official reports maintained their comfortable fiction of manageable losses, individual accounts from those who experienced submarine attacks firsthand revealed the truth. Thousands of Japanese merchant mariners and naval personnel experienced submarine attacks personally, and their stories, collected systematically after the war, painted a picture of mounting terror on Japan's sea lanes that contradicted every official assessment. Merchant Captain Yoshida Mitsuo survived 4 separate submarine attacks during his wartime service. His account, published in 1955 once he felt able to speak freely, describes a cycle of mounting psychological trauma. By 1944, he wrote, every departure from port felt like a death sentence being pronounced. They knew submarines waited everywhere along their routes. The Navy continued telling them to sail independently at high speed, which Yoshida characterized as suicide dressed up as tactical doctrine. Merchant captains begged for escorts, for air cover, for any protection against the submarines they knew were hunting them. Navy officials told them submarines represented only a minor threat that could be evaded through proper seamanship and high speed. Radio operator Tanaka Kenji served on 6 different vessels during the war. 5 of those 6 ships were sunk by submarines. He testified after the war that after his 3rd sinking, he had reported to headquarters that submarine attacks were constant, intensive, and clearly coordinated. An officer told him he was exaggerating based on unusual personal experience, that he had simply been unlucky. Unlucky 5 times out of 6 ships? The mathematics spoke for themselves about what was actually happening in Japanese waters. The most controversial submarine attack of the entire war involved the Awa Maru, torpedoed by USS Queenfish on April 1, 1945. This 11,739-ton passenger cargo vessel had been granted explicit safe passage by the United States government to carry Red Cross supplies to Allied prisoners of war in Japanese camps. In conditions of poor visibility, Queenfish's commander mistook her for a destroyer and attacked. Of 2,004 passengers and crew aboard, only one person survived. Sasaki Hiroshi, an engineer, later provided testimony about the incident that led to significant diplomatic complications. The sinking violated international agreements and resulted in the submarine commander facing a court-martial for negligence in verifying his target's identity, though he was ultimately found guilty only of minor charges given the combat conditions and visibility limitations. The incident demonstrated that even vessels granted safe passage operated under constant threat in submarine-infested waters. The submarine campaign's impact extended far beyond simple shipping tonnage statistics into the fundamental capacity of Japanese industry to function. By 1944, Japanese industrial production was dying from resource starvation, slowly suffocating from lack of raw materials. The numbers were catastrophic in their implications, yet they remained officially minimized in assessments presented to leadership. Japan's steel production depended absolutely on iron ore imported from China and Malaya. In 1943, total imports reached 4.3 million tons. By 1944, despite Japan still controlling the same ore-producing territories, imports fell precipitously to only 2.1 million tons. Steel production, which had peaked at 7.8 million tons in 1943, collapsed to just 800,000 tons by 1945, barely 10% of peak production. The missing ore lay scattered across the Pacific seabed in the holds of sunken ships that never reached Japanese ports. Aluminum production faced a similarly devastating collapse. Bauxite imports from the Netherlands East Indies fell from 750,000 tons in 1943 to 280,000 tons in 1944. Aluminum production plummeted from 151,000 tons in 1943 to a mere 7,000 tons in 1944, a 95% decline directly attributable to submarine interdiction of shipping lanes. Engineer Takahashi Sankichi, who worked at the Yokohama shipyard throughout the war, described the cascading failures that resulted from these supply disruptions. First, he recalled, raw materials became sporadic and unpredictable. Then, they stopped arriving entirely. The shipyard had workers eager to produce, functioning facilities ready to build, but absolutely nothing to build with. Management kept insisting that materials were in transit, that deliveries would resume soon. The workers knew the truth. Those materials rested on the ocean floor, along with the ships that were supposed to deliver them. Perhaps nowhere was submarine impact more decisive, yet more systematically denied than in the destruction of Japanese air power, accomplished not primarily through aerial combat, but through fuel starvation that left aircraft grounded. Commander Okumiya Masatake, an air staff officer with the 1st Air Fleet, documented this collapse in his detailed post-war account. By October 1944, he wrote, they had 3,000 trained pilots and 2,000 operational aircraft available for combat operations. They had fuel for perhaps 200 total hours of flight operations. Not 200 hours per pilot. 200 hours total for the entire force. The submarine campaign had created a cascading failure mechanism that strangled Japanese air power. Tankers couldn't deliver aviation gasoline to refineries and airfields. Without fuel, pilots couldn't train. Without training, even available aircraft became useless for combat operations. Yet Tokyo continued issuing operational orders that assumed normal fuel supplies would somehow be available to support planned missions. November 24, 1944, marked the first B-29 raid on Tokyo launched from newly captured bases in the Marianas. Of 111 bombers attacking the capital, Japanese fighters managed to intercept only 17. This abysmal intercept rate resulted not from lack of aircraft or shortage of pilots, but from simple lack of aviation fuel to get interceptors airborne in sufficient numbers. That fuel, which could have defended the homeland, lay at the bottom of the ocean where submarines had sent the tankers carrying it. American submarines' technological superiority grew consistently throughout the war, with radar providing perhaps the most decisive advantage. By 1944, every American submarine carried SJ surface search radar that allowed them to detect targets at night well beyond visual range. Japanese escorts, by contrast, remained largely radar blind, dependent on visual lookouts and primitive sonar that submarines could easily evade. Lieutenant Commander Yamada Takeo, who commanded the destroyer Shigure in numerous convoy actions, described the impossible tactical situation Japanese escorts confronted. American submarines could see Japanese forces when the Japanese couldn't see them. They tracked convoys from beyond the horizon using radar. They attacked on the surface at night, using superior speed and radar guidance to evade the blind groping of escorts who couldn't detect them. The Japanese were fighting invisible opponents who possessed complete information advantage. The Japanese Navy possessed radar technology and understood its value, but couldn't deploy it effectively due to component shortages caused by submarine interdiction of raw materials necessary for electronics production. By late 1944, only 30% of Japanese escorts carried any form of radar, and these were mostly primitive sets with detection ranges under 5 miles. American SJ radar could detect targets at 15 miles or more, providing an enormous tactical advantage in night operations. This technological gap produced increasingly one-sided encounters that resembled massacres more than battles. USS Batfish demonstrated this superiority dramatically in February 1945 when she sank 3 Japanese submarines in 76 hours. RO-55, RO-112, and RO-113 were all detected by radar before they knew Batfish existed in their vicinity. All 3 were destroyed before they could react to the threat. The submarine-induced fuel crisis contributed directly to Japan's adoption of kamikaze tactics, the desperate suicide attacks that characterized the war's final year. With insufficient fuel available to train pilots properly through the hundreds of hours traditionally required, the military chose instead to use minimally trained pilots for one-way missions that required only enough skill to take off, reach the target area, and aim the aircraft at a ship. The submarines, by strangling fuel supplies, had helped create the desperation that made suicide tactics seem rational. Vice Admiral Onishi Takajiro, recognized as the father of the organized kamikaze program, privately acknowledged this connection to fuel shortages. His chief of staff, Captain Inoguchi Rikihei, recorded Onishi's words in his personal notes. "They had fuel sufficient for 1 mission per aircraft," Onishi explained. "They could either waste that fuel on inadequate training that still wouldn't produce fully qualified combat pilots, or they could use it for final attacks that might achieve results." The submarines, Onishi admitted, had effectively made the choice for them by eliminating the option of proper training. The first organized kamikaze attacks on October 25, 1944, employed pilots with an average of only 40 hours of flight time. Before the submarine campaign strangled fuel supplies, minimum combat training had required 300 hours. The submarines had indirectly created the desperation that produced the kamikaze phenomenon, one of the war's most tragic elements. As 1945 began, Japan retained only 2.1 million tons of merchant shipping, less than 1/3 of pre-war tonnage, and well below the minimum required to sustain the home island's population and industry. American submarines were sinking ships faster than Japan could build replacements, yet official planning documents continued assuming shipping capacity would somehow recover to support projected operations. The disconnect between planning assumptions and reality had become absolute. The Fundamental Policy for Future War Guidance, formally approved by the Imperial Conference on January 20, 1945, allocated shipping tonnage that no longer existed for military operations that could never occur. The policy document assumed 3.5 million tons of shipping would be available to support operations. Actual tonnage stood at 2.1 million and was falling daily as submarines continued their methodical destruction. Nobody in the planning process apparently questioned this massive discrepancy or asked how operations would be supported with shipping that didn't exist. By March 1945, the submarine noose had tightened to complete strangulation. Japan's remaining merchant ships huddled in harbours, their crews terrified to venture into submarine-infested waters. The maritime nation that had conquered much of the Pacific and Indian Oceans could no longer safely sail its own coastal waters. Merchant captains who had survived multiple attacks refused assignments, knowing each voyage might be their last. The final demonstration of how completely submarines had destroyed Japanese maritime capability came with Operation Starvation, the B-29 aerial mining campaign against Japanese home waters that began March 27, 1945. While this was an air operation rather than submarine warfare, its devastating success depended entirely on submarines having first destroyed Japan's capacity to respond to mining. Japanese minesweepers, critically short of fuel due to submarine attacks on tankers, could barely operate at minimal levels. The specialized equipment needed for clearing magnetic and acoustic mines hadn't arrived from Germany because submarines had sunk the ships attempting to transport it. The Japanese Navy could only watch helplessly as B-29s methodically closed their remaining ports with mines they lacked the resources to clear. Admiral Nomura Nayokuni, responsible for mine warfare operations, testified after the war with obvious frustration about the impossible situation. They knew exactly what types of mines the Americans were dropping. They possessed the technical knowledge to sweep them effectively. They lacked fuel to send minesweepers out in sufficient numbers and lacked equipment to clear the sophisticated mines being used. Both shortages traced directly to submarine attacks that had destroyed the supply chain. The last major convoy from Singapore, designated High 88J, departed on March 26, 1945. Aircraft from the 345th Bomb Group supplemented submarine operations to decimate the convoy before it could reach relative safety. Of 6 ships that began the voyage, only one reached Japan. The massive 11,000-ton tanker Sarawak Maru went down carrying desperately needed oil that would never fuel Japanese ships or aircraft. After High 88J, organized convoy operations essentially ceased. Japan's maritime commerce had been strangled into non-existence. The final accounting of American submarine effectiveness in the Pacific War produced numbers that stagger comprehension. 3.2 million tons of merchant shipping sunk, 1,113 merchant vessels destroyed across the Pacific and Southeast Asian waters. 201 naval vessels sunk, totaling 540,192 tons of Japanese warships sent to the bottom. Approximately 27,000 Japanese merchant mariners killed, representing one of the war's highest occupational mortality rates. 52 American submarines lost with 3,505 submariners killed, representing the highest casualty rate of any American military service branch. Yet even in total defeat, full acknowledgement of submarine effectiveness came slowly and reluctantly. The Japanese Navy's final wartime assessment, issued on August 10, 1945, just days before surrender, attributed only 2.8 million tons to submarine attack, barely half the actual total confirmed by post-war analysis. The denial persisted literally until the Empire's final hours. Only after surrender, when American interrogators began systematic questioning of Japanese naval officers and officials, did Japanese leadership fully confront the submarine reality they had avoided for 4 years. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interrogations that revealed consistent patterns of denial and rationalization that persisted even in defeat, even when the war was over and there was nothing left to deny. Admiral Toyoda Somu, the Navy's final commander-in-chief, testified in October 1945 with remarkable candor about institutional blindness. They had known submarines were inflicting severe losses, he admitted, but reorganizing their entire strategic thinking during wartime had seemed impossible. Their doctrine, training, equipment, and institutional culture were all based fundamentally on the concept of decisive surface battle, not commerce protection or defensive warfare. By the time they recognized the submarine threat's true magnitude, it was simply too late to adapt effectively. The war was already lost. Captain Oyatsushi, the naval historian who would compile Japan's official war history in subsequent years, proved more blunt in his assessment. Japan had committed strategic suicide through willful blindness, he stated. The evidence of submarine effectiveness had been overwhelming by 1943, absolutely undeniable to anyone willing to examine it objectively. But acknowledging that evidence would have required admitting their fundamental naval doctrine was wrong from its very foundation. The institution chose comfortable denial over painful adaptation, and that choice destroyed the empire. Some Japanese officers had recognized the submarine threat early in the war and attempted to warn their superiors, but they were systematically ignored or silenced. Commander Chihaya Masataka submitted a report in 1942 warning that American submarine doctrine focused on commerce warfare and would prove devastating if not countered aggressively. His report was filed without any action being taken on its recommendations. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka Yahachi submitted a detailed analysis in January 1943, warning that American submarines would sink over 3 million tons of shipping by war's end unless immediate and drastic countermeasures were implemented. He was transferred to a shore position for allegedly defeatist thinking that undermined morale. His estimate, dismissed as alarmist, proved conservative. Actual losses exceeded his prediction. Japanese naval leadership consistently underestimated American submarine capabilities while simultaneously overestimating their own anti-submarine effectiveness. Japanese submarines were technically impressive in many respects. They could dive deeper than American boats, possessed longer range for extended patrols, and the I-400 class represented the largest submarines built by any nation during the entire war. But impressive specifications didn't translate to operational effectiveness. Japanese submarines suffered from slow diving times that left them vulnerable to air attack, poor radar that left them blind at night, unreliable engines that frequently broke down, and most critically, misguided doctrine that emphasized warship attacks over the commerce raiding that might have impacted American operations. Meanwhile, Japanese anti-submarine capabilities remained a generation behind Allied standards. Their depth charges were typically set too shallow, rarely reaching American submarines operating routinely below 300 feet. Their sonar equipment lagged behind American technology by years. Commander Yasuma Takashige, who commanded anti-submarine operations from the critical base at Truk, testified after the war about the technological and tactical mismatch. Japan was fighting modern submarines with tactics essentially unchanged from 1918, he explained. They listened with primitive hydrophones when American submarines had radar allowing surface attacks at night. They dropped depth charges at 100 feet when American submarines routinely operated at 400 feet or deeper. They never meaningfully adapted because adaptation would require publicly admitting inferiority, which was institutionally impossible. Beyond the cold tonnage statistics lay profound human tragedy that official records never captured. The approximately 27,000 Japanese merchant mariners who died at sea represented a casualty rate exceeding 15%, higher than many frontline combat units. Yet these deaths went largely unrecognized and unacknowledged. While kamikaze pilots were celebrated as heroes who sacrificed themselves for the emperor, merchant mariners who died in torpedo explosions and sinking ships remained invisible in official narratives and received no recognition. Survivor Yamamoto Taro, who endured 3 separate submarine sinkings and lived to write about his experiences, captured the bitter sense of abandonment merchant mariners felt. They were expendable, he wrote. The Navy insisted submarines posed no serious threat. then sent merchant sailors to sea without escorts or protection. When ships were sunk, the Navy blamed crews for poor seamanship or lack of vigilance. When mariners complained about impossible conditions, their courage was questioned. They died by the thousands while being told the threat wasn't real. The psychological trauma among survivors was severe and widespread, but went completely undocumented. Japanese culture had no framework for acknowledging what would later be called combat stress disorder among civilian workers. Merchant mariners who refused to sail after surviving multiple sinkings were branded as cowards, their trauma dismissed as weakness of character. Many continued sailing despite overwhelming fear because refusing duty meant social disgrace worse than death. The submarine campaign triggered cascading economic collapse that preceded and enabled eventual military defeat. By early 1945, Japanese war production had fallen to 35% of peak capacity, a collapse caused not primarily by American bombing, but by material starvation resulting from submarine interdiction of supply routes. This cascade of failure touched every aspect of Japanese society and economy. Rice rations in Japanese cities fell steadily, not because of crop failure, but because coastal shipping couldn't move food from producing regions to consuming populations. Coal shortages forced power plants to reduce generation or shut down entirely, darkening cities. Hospitals ran short of basic medicines and supplies. By spring 1945, Japan faced genuine starvation, not from insufficient food production, but from complete inability to distribute existing supplies once the maritime transportation system collapsed. Economic Planning Board Director Suzuki Teichi testified after the war about the submarine campaign's comprehensive economic impact. The submarines destroyed Japan's economy more thoroughly than 1,000 B-29 raids could have achieved, he stated. Bombing destroyed individual facilities that could potentially be rebuilt. Submarines destroyed the circulation system itself. An economy without functioning transportation, he observed, was a corpse no matter how many intact factories it possessed. American submarine commanders expressed consistent puzzlement in their patrol reports about Japanese failure to adapt tactics or improve defenses. They expected Japanese forces to learn and evolve, but instead found the same vulnerabilities present in 1942 still exploitable in 1945. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo wrote in January 1943 that Japanese escorts were remarkably predictable and completely ineffective. They dropped depth charges in preset patterns regardless of the submarine's actual position. They abandoned convoy protection to chase submarines futilely, leaving merchants undefended. Commander Richard O'Kane of USS Tang reported in 1944 his amazement that merchants still sailed independently without zigzagging, presenting perfect targets in broad daylight. Escorts continued using active sonar continuously, advertising their positions to submarines equipped to detect these transmissions. The Japanese still hadn't grasped that American submarines attacked primarily on the surface at night using radar, not submerged during daylight using periscope observations. Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb, the war's most successful submarine commander by tonnage sunk per patrol time, testified that American submariners expected Japanese forces to adapt and improve over time. They never did, he noted. In 1945, Americans were still using essentially the same tactics that had worked effectively in 1942. The Japanese died by the thousands rather than fundamentally change their doctrine or acknowledge its failure. Japan possessed opportunities to reduce submarine effectiveness significantly, but consistently failed to exploit them. German U-boat technology and hard-won tactical lessons were available through Axis cooperation agreements, but Japanese naval authorities largely ignored these offerings as irrelevant to Pacific conditions. The Germans had developed and offered advanced sonar designs superior to Japanese equipment, radar detection equipment that could warn of American radar use, convoy tactics proven effective in the Atlantic after years of costly learning, and acoustic torpedoes specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. Japanese naval attachés in Berlin dutifully reported these offerings to Tokyo, but headquarters showed minimal interest in adopting German innovations. Japanese institutional pride prevented acknowledging that Germans might understand anti-submarine warfare better than the Imperial Japanese Navy, despite having fought submarines continuously for years, while Japan dismissed the threat. Commander Yokoi Toshiyuki, serving as naval attaché in Berlin, wrote with obvious frustration that Germans had fought submarines intensively for 3 years and were offering hard-won expertise freely. Tokyo rejected most suggestions as inappropriate for Japanese conditions or incompatible with Japanese methods, essentially preferring comfortable failure to admitting others might teach them something. The final accounting of submarine warfare's impact produces numbers that continue to stagger comprehension decades later. Japan entered the war with dreams of empire spanning the Pacific and Southeast Asia, of resource security and economic dominance. Submarines sank those dreams systematically, ship by ship, ton by ton, until nothing remained but wreckage and starvation. The 5.3 million tons sunk by submarines represented not merely steel and cargo space, but Japan's entire capacity to wage modern industrial war. Millions of tons of crude oil never refined into fuel. Mountains of iron ore never smelted into steel. Rice never distributed to feed populations and workers. Raw materials never transformed into weapons and ammunition. These missing resources translated directly into military impotence that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. Battleships sat immobilized at anchor for lack of fuel oil to move them. Aircraft remained permanently grounded without aviation gasoline. Factories stood idle despite intact machinery because raw materials never arrived. The industrial nation that had audaciously challenged American power found itself reduced to pre-industrial transportation capacity, unable to move goods or resources more than short distances. Military historians analyzing Japan's submarine denial have identified several interconnected factors that contributed to this institutional blindness. Doctrinal rigidity stood foremost. The Japanese Navy's pre-war doctrine had ossified into unquestionable dogma. Having declared commerce warfare ineffective and beneath proper naval consideration, they could not acknowledge its devastating success without admitting fundamental error that would undermine institutional legitimacy. Cultural factors compounded the problem. The Japanese concept of face made acknowledging mistakes and reversing positions extremely difficult for individuals and institutions. The submarine threat had been publicly dismissed early in the war. Reversing that position would require senior officers to acknowledge they had been catastrophically wrong, an admission that would cost them authority and respect in a rigidly hierarchical system. Institutional blindness reinforced denial. The rigid hierarchy prevented junior officers who recognized the threat from effectively communicating concerns upward through channels. Senior officers who had originally dismissed submarines couldn't reverse their position without losing face and authority. The system was structurally incapable of self-correction once initial assessments proved wrong. Technological arrogance played a significant role. Japanese belief in spiritual superiority over material factors created cognitive blindness to American advantages in radar technology, code-breaking capabilities, and submarine design. The idea that Americans might be technologically superior contradicted core assumptions about Japanese cultural and spiritual superiority, making evidence of American advantages difficult to accept psychologically. Statistical manipulation provided comfortable alternatives to acknowledging reality. As long as losses could be attributed to mines, weather, marine casualties, or other causes, the specific threat of submarines could be minimized in official assessments. This allowed planning to continue based on assumptions that bore no relationship to operational reality but preserved institutional comfort. Inter-service rivalry prevented comprehensive accounting. Army and Navy losses were never properly combined, allowing each service to minimize its own losses while remaining ignorant of the total picture. This fragmented accounting system made it easier to maintain denial about the aggregate catastrophe. 60 years after the war, Japanese naval historian Captain Hara Tamichi, who served throughout the war and survived to analyze his service's failures, delivered a definitive judgment. Japan lost the war to submarines but could never publicly admit it, he wrote. To acknowledge submarine effectiveness completely meant acknowledging complete strategic failure extending from pre-war planning through final defeat. The institution chose comfortable delusion over uncomfortable truth. That choice, Hara concluded, cost Japan its empire and nearly destroyed the nation itself. American naval historian Clay Blair, who spent decades researching submarine operations, reached a complementary conclusion. No military force in recorded history achieved more with fewer resources than American submarines in the Pacific War, he wrote. Comprising less than 2% of total United States Navy personnel, submarines destroyed over 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. They succeeded not through numerical superiority, but through technological advantage, superior training, correct doctrine, and Japanese institutional refusal to acknowledge their effectiveness until far too late to matter. The last surviving Japanese naval officer to hold submarine command during the war, Commander Hashimoto Mochitsura, who notably commanded the submarine that sank USS Indianapolis in the war's final weeks, reflected in the year 2000 at age 91 on his service's failures. Japan never understood American submarine warfare, he concluded, because the Japanese fundamentally never understood American strategic thinking. Americans fought an economic war aimed at destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. Japanese fought a war of honor seeking decisive battle and glory. Americans systematically targeted Japan's critical vulnerability, absolute dependence on maritime shipping. Japanese ignored submarine success because it didn't conform to their concept of how naval warfare should be conducted. This fundamental incompatibility of strategic vision doomed Japan from the war's opening. The Japanese inability to acknowledge submarine effectiveness stands historically as perhaps the premier example of how institutional denial can defeat even the most determined efforts at institutional survival. Despite overwhelming evidence accumulated over years, despite clear statistics that couldn't be hidden, despite mounting disasters that touched every aspect of the empire, Japanese leadership maintained systematic denial until the empire lay in complete ruins and surrender became unavoidable. Modern military institutions worldwide study Japan's submarine blindness as an essential warning against the dangers of doctrinal rigidity and institutional arrogance. When institutional culture actively prevents acknowledging unwelcome realities, when doctrine becomes dogma that cannot be questioned, defeat becomes mathematically inevitable regardless of courage, determination, or material resources. The submarines didn't defeat Japan alone. Allied forces contributed across multiple domains, but the submarine campaign proved absolutely decisive in destroying Japan's capacity to sustain modern warfare. More significantly for historical analysis, Japanese denial of submarine effectiveness ensured that the damage remained unaddressed until repair became impossible. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served in the Pacific and later became Chief of Naval Operations in the post-war period, provided perhaps the most succinct summary. The Japanese Navy died of willful blindness, he stated. They possessed excellent officers, demonstrated courage beyond question, and controlled adequate resources through 1943. They lacked only the institutional courage to admit fundamental error and adapt accordingly. That single lack cost them absolutely everything they possessed and sought to defend. The story concludes where it began, in Pacific waters. But now, instead of Vice Admiral Kurita dismissing phantom submarines in October 1944 minutes before his flagship exploded beneath him, we have a final image from August 1945. Emperor Hirohito stood in his Tokyo palace, surrounded by advisors, looking at charts displaying Japan's surviving merchant fleet. Less than 1.5 million tons remained from over 10 million tons controlled or accessible in 1942. The graph lines showed collapse so complete it resembled a cliff face. The emperor asked his naval minister directly how Japan had lost so much shipping, how this catastrophe had occurred. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa finally spoke complete truth after years of carefully edited reports and optimistic assessments. "American submarines, Your Majesty," he stated. The Navy could not believe their effectiveness until far too late to respond meaningfully. Leadership chose to maintain comfortable illusions rather than confront painful reality. The submarines destroyed not merely ships, but Japan's fundamental ability to wage industrial warfare. The Emperor nodded slowly, saying nothing further. The war was over. The submarines had achieved victory so complete that Japan possessed no capacity to continue fighting regardless of determination or will. Japan had lost not merely to American submarines, but to its own profound inability to believe what those submarines were systematically achieving across 4 years of war. The final numbers were irrefutable and devastating beyond any possibility of denial or minimization. American submarines had destroyed over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping. The Japanese naval establishment could not permit itself to believe this was happening even as their empire strangled from lack of supplies, fuel, food, and raw materials. They maintained systematic disbelief until the absolute end, when belief no longer mattered because the ships, the cargo, the fuel, the empire itself, and the capacity to resist all lay scattered across the Pacific floor. In the final analysis, the greatest American submarine victory transcended mere tonnage sunk or ships destroyed. The true victory was the psychological paralysis inflicted on Japanese leadership, the absolute inability to accept what was occurring even as it destroyed their capacity to fight. Japanese leaders could not believe American submarines were achieving such dominance. That fundamental disbelief ensured the submarines succeeded beyond even America's most optimistic expectations or planning assumptions. The story of systematic Japanese denial regarding American submarine effectiveness remains history's starkest and most comprehensive reminder that refusing to acknowledge unwelcome truths doesn't make those truths less real or less devastating. Denial only makes eventual defeat more certain, more complete, and more catastrophic. The 5 million tons of shipping resting on the Pacific floor testified to a truth Japan could never permit itself to accept despite overwhelming evidence. In modern industrial warfare, production capacity and technological sophistication triumph decisively over martial spirit and warrior tradition. The submarines taught this lesson methodically, ship by ship, ton by ton, convoy by convoy, until no ships remained to sustain the illusion of Japanese victory or even survival. The Japanese could not believe that American submarines sank over 5 million tons of their shipping despite experiencing it directly through 4 years of war. That institutional disbelief became their historical epitaph, the judgment history would render on their strategic blindness. They drowned in denial as surely as their merchant mariners drowned in torpedo-torn ships across the Pacific, and that denial proved more fatal than any weapon American forces deployed against them.